Nyombe nyimba tembala, the new mobile haku rest in the name of new mobile. All those chine Chimotes had the dos chin chevale. Are they that didn't man share that the senior banana that tarzing it was the Mawa share.
So we are looking at the actual identification of the mental afflictions on page 168. And the purpose is, in order to abandon the afflictions, what the afflictions need to be identified or known. So we've looked at several. We come now to, I think it's the sixth, perhaps. So the view of holding to an extreme near the bottom of page 168.
The Tarzimbe Tawase, the Tarzimbe Tawani, and Jigde Gang Sovig, Da de la Mine, Tapa, Tersubam, Dine, Chimaran in some jaw maybe, Cheber Davigi, Sherab Numagenos.
So actually the seventh, the view holding to an extreme is an afflicted intelligence that observes the self as it is apprehended by the view of the transitory collection and views it either as permanent and enduring or as being annihilated without being reborn from this existence to a future one.
Jigde Zimbige da Yorba, the Jigde Karsana, Rangi, Ngala, Mine, Ngadi, Dadu to Zingruan, Dadu to Zimbro. Chetan Jigde di Miege, Dadi, Miche, Dadi, Jigde, Miba Nation, Dagaran Re Saji, sometimes, the Denigi sometimes Lutila, the Denigi Shera Numajan, the Jigda Sachi Chagurua.
Grasping at the eye, grasping at the eye. Wait, let me just get this again.
Deji Jigda se Jorwa, Jigda di Karimus Ranju Yangala Miche, Ngadi Dadu Juba Zimbarwa. Chizada Dadu Juba Zimba and Jigdagi Mu di Dadu Juba Zimba Tadirwa. Chizan di Dadila Miche, di Tadi. Dagaran race, the Yuokune Meva Tapa, and the Yuokune Meva di Dagaran race some time that Tarzime Tawas.
So grasping at if one is holding the view of the transitory collection, so the previous view or previous affliction, holding the grasping at the view of the transitory collection, one then goes on to believe that the eye exists in the way that it appears as being permanent, unchanging. This would be an illustration of the view holding to an extreme.
Dela mine da jidage gansunwe da dela mine de mine diga chosen dinige da di dagbares ane terzukres dagbare da gyudan gela mideba dagba ane terzukse de gyogune joye metegen an terzuk ni denisires dene ane chima nisam joa joa mebege jide kada ko shiye yo mare shi chene ba ane shi meba chaden joa chima nisam jose dene yo mare da ko Cheba Messu, Gunche Medigan, Dadi, Nakidi, Nakonedi, Tapa, Denishi Esne, Dendig, Davi, Sheriff, Numa Gendeleta, Tarda, Sachila, Goresh Tarda.
The object of the previous one, the object of the view of the transitory collection, is the self. And here, now in this one, the self, that is the object of the view of the transitory collection is taken as being either permanent and enduring. So the meaning is unchanging of both terms, permanence and enduring, that it's unchanging. Or it is that at death, it is completely eradicated. so there can be no rebirth, which is the rest of the sentence, or as being annihilated, being reborn from this existence without being born from this existence to a future one. So either the self is grasped at as being permanent, enduring, in other words, unchanging, or that it is annihilated or severed at the time of death, and therefore no rebirth follows. So this is a view that probably we don't have. It's a view much more likely to be held by non-Buddhists, a view developed independent on their philosophy. The eighth, the view holding, so just as the view holding a view to be best, so as inserted, a bad view or a wrong view, the view holding a bad view to be best is an afflicted intelligence that observes any of the three, the view of the transitory collection, the view holding to an extreme or a wrong view, and the aggregate of the person holding the view based on which the view arises, and holds that view to be best.
지유 다들 대시 풍부 다들 미제 네 안에 초도 교발에서 진비셔는 연마전 다디 약쇼래서 베니 지다들 미제 지다들 빼 약쇼래 지소에 따와디 약쇼래서다 내게 디지 탈진배 따와되면 디 탈진배 따와 빼면서 약고래다 디 따와는 따와 약쇼래서다 내게 초도 진바 진야디 좀 진비게다 셔는 연마전지라 아니 따와 초도 진바스.
So as it says here, there are three potential objects, either the view of the transitory collection or the view holding to an extreme or a wrong view. And here the person holds any of these views as being extreme, as being supreme rather, as being supreme.
초진 니인사 차주봉의 추림다 안에 차지당 추다 안에 류마기 주버 예버의 제비기 두슈당 안에 갈라 띠네 대다 주의 풍부할 미네 디바 다바당 뇨모레 저월 코월에 예버의 진비기 따위 셔르 뇨모제노스 다 추림 두슈 소아디 되는 시에서.
So like with view holding to an extreme, also the view holding a bad view to be best, this is something that we are unlikely to have. Again, this is something more likely that a non-Buddhist view holder would have. Then the ninth, so I've just changed the translation of this one term. The view holding ethics and religious conduct to be best is an afflicted intelligence that observes ethics of giving up immorality and religious conduct that set a certain dress code, manner, and bodily or verbal comportment, as well as the aggregates through which the very view arises, and views them as sufficient for purifying bad actions, liberating from the mental afflictions, and releasing one from cyclic existence.
안엘이야 주름다 두주 초선지 주름 초도 진바세 단 두주 초도 진바 이용 거래 디나데 니가 장의점도 진나를 장의 잡셔라만 된다라 디나데 주름 초도 진바다 두주 초도 진바세 이용 거래.
So here these two are presented differently, ethics and religious conduct. But usually they will be presented together, but here they've been separated.
된다라 그래서네 언제 체제다 주다 류마기 주바 녀버집이 두슈세다 당은 저기 델이야 두로 체지 두로 거야라서 바당 되네기 안에 지금 류기 자와 류기 저타라 안에 나세 근데 말들이다 류라 그래서네 같이 아니 ndiwa ane mawo shuya dan chuen dama juya la so ba da ane lu ndulo ma ma kon ba ane jiki du shen je de la so ba da denen gishi ma shi ba nga je ne je wo re sa de nga je wo re sa de ni gi sun ya de ni gi sam da de o da chi kan je le gishi ma shi ba she nga je du shen de we na da di song ba na da 예 저와 타바도 비규리에 타바도 그래서다 되게 수리 되게 소야 되게 수림 줘도 좀 봐. 세세들 온도시네 내가 되게 도시 삼다이다 간실에 가시 내가 좀 디용으로 와변에 나중에 내가 다시 통야래 힌두 되게 되네 둘로 되네 거야다 되네 도와 탈라 주야라 소바다 되네 민비게다 지금 둘로마가 말한 바지 파 지게 니데니기 안두트게 네들도 스테야라 소바디지그라딘 데서 두슈 심바세데 두슈세데 데니시 응에송거와 엔르이게 저와 나 시베네 칼갑제 카기니 예시마셔 두두시네 나 예시미 마셔바 카갑이야라 소바다 데니게 제디게 다 두슈 심바데니.
Then it's these two, religious holding ethics and religious conduct, then are presented. So it's as an afflicted intelligence that observes ethics of giving up immorality. So that's the first, holding ethics. And the second, religious conduct, then is explained as that certain dress code, manner, and bodily or verbal comportment. So this, we can think of illustrations perhaps that we've seen in India, that certain religious Hindu sects still practice these codes of religious conduct that they see by which they will purify bad actions, gain liberation from the mental afflictions, and release from cyclic existence. So things as, for example, dress codes, so certain things be worn or not worn, or no clothes be worn at all. And in terms of, so that what's translated manner would be better rather than the plural, in that it is the way things are done. And so the manner in which things are done. So that, again, would be certain religious codes will have various things that will be done, maybe standing on one leg and so forth. And bodily or verbal comportment, which is similar. So verbal comportment could be a vow of silence, for example. So there are illustrations of this still in India today.
내가 상예 줌내 되게 두시 심바서 차고래. 알아서 상예 줌내 되게 두시 심바로 제가 상예 줌내네 가르스 둘로 가르스 공고래. 나섬 지가르스 난고래. 디나신 아주 류기 도시네. 제 지게 송야라서 바다 나게 송야라서 바다 류기 근데 자주라서 바 내가 저게 차세야 최고부야라서 바 얘네게 류기디 제바디 만족이 뒤주신 봐야 돼. 디 소속이다. 로번 디기 간에 제바나 디 나신지 자주디 제야 되라. 뒤주신 봐야 되는 거고래. 알게 제메. 네. 라고만 되네.
So this term that I've preferred to translate as religious conduct, or they have as ascetic practices. There is an ascetic English translation. It really is a term difficult to translate. But to give an explanation of it, so religious conduct, we follow the religious conduct of the Buddha. So the religious conduct is as the Buddha practiced and taught to be practiced. So whether it's things like the ordained wearing robes, and certain types of robes, and doing certain kinds of what was the word? Comportment, such as prostrations, making offerings, and so forth. So this is the religious conduct of those who follow the Buddha would engage in.
Is that Geshe Thubten Rabten 추림다 두슈디게 다 초도 규발에 딜레 약쇼레스 다디 타로토비기 교코와르 드비 뉴 디제 세네도시네 디바타기레 세 삼다엔서 초도 규발에 세 삼다에 채월 베네 디네도와 베네 가시 강바 직파 주제 ane kangpa chik tsu ibu chene jika yaa lang che du chen che chorwa da di denegi di tuishu denegi nyamlen che penma si yaksho re da di tarpa denegi chene tarpa tukure se samdaan se jisa tuishu chodo zimba se jisa chodo zimba se tuishu zimba yung de chodo zimba se di le lakwa yoma re da di yaksho re se samdaan di re se da di denegi samdaan di denegi zimba ne di kowa le tarwi yung gyu re se denegi samdaan shira nyomo chene da karso re that didn't do certain to each other in Basia.
But this being an afflicted intelligence relates to the conduct or the religious conduct of practitioners who believe by doing things such as standing on one leg for one's life or for many years, that this is through that religious conduct one will purify bad actions, purify non-virtue, gain liberation from the afflictions, and even liberation from cyclic existence itself. So this is their religious conduct by which they believe spiritual development will come. And they hold that to be best or to be supreme. But this is an afflicted intelligence in that it cannot lead to that desired result.
Denegi samdadi da ko taro topiki chodo gyube gyuzo diri sigyo mara dangan zui garesne taro toyala zo gyudi nyomo bi nyimbo den dame ba to be shira kom ani dele roba ani njimba da surin sebala sobeki denegi nyamnen chene tarpa se tobu gure esema denegi jige Lugi, Jaju, Diniche, Zambi, Tapa Toto, Mares, Juan, Toto Mares, Cesari, the Tapa to be Guru, Choto, Duchak Mares, and the Diro. Cesada, the Denegi, Tawa Chilia, Denegi, Choto Zimbare, de Koala Trivik, Guri, Cesadi, Yamazino Koala Trivik, Sachi, Tawa Zimba, that Tawa, because Choto Zimbas.
Whereas, as Buddhists, the religious conduct that we would hold to be supreme would be nothing like that. Rather, we identify that the very cause of our suffering is the afflictions and the karma they've created, and it's through abandoning in particular the afflictions that liberation is attained. And not just abandoning the afflictions, but also their seeds. So that is the primary conduct of Buddhists. And it is assisted by a variety of other conducts, such as training in generosity, ethics, patience, joy, perseverance, and so forth.
Wanchu dan zuo so zhuyun yuri zimbige zhodo ki shirab nyuma jenos.
Then the final in this presentation of 10, the final affliction, that of wrong views. A wrong view is an afflicted intelligence that makes denials, like saying that past and future lives, actions and their effects and the like do not exist, or that superimposes their apprehension of Isvara, a fundamental nature. We had the other night as the general principle, and the like as the cause of sentient beings.
어느 생각이 세디 개왕같이 개왕아마 요말에 개와치마 요말에 선배 삼노디다 록다직세오래 달레균의 요말에 세다 아니 권조숨 요말에 세 레균의다 매제 레균의소 매제 구와대바다 세디 레균의 요말에 세다 되네는 권조숨사 상계 최고의 근위 상계권 최고의 권조사의 요말에 선배 되네게 삼다디 되네게 samdayadi da lokdari eser lokda didi lokdache.
The wrong views has these two parts, that of denying what exists, denying in the sense of what actually does exist, holding that it does not, such as reincarnation, karma, and the three jewels. So believing that they do not exist when in reality they do, that is a wrong view.
되네 다되네게 원주당 소소 주윤 유르진바사 당은주 기신 준준나라 시야리레 제사 원주 시야디 안데 지den군이 제법 원주 쇠바레 세진 주위 유레 제사 원주 시야다 조세데 지조 조세디 다되네 안주 주위 유레 제상은주 조 심전 차선 수쇠바레는 원주 쇠바레 원주 제 차산 제법 원주리에서 삼다야다 직제 아직 어떤 건지 차산 좋아 심진 미다 지신라서 차산随跟的 수레신 조세들이 조어디 주셔버려서 제산다 원주의 주의 규례에서 조어디 주의 규례에서 내내게 진비게다 니 조도래 조도가 차 매바지 되게 조도 차디 셔라니 맞는데다 어디야 lok다리에서 대지디 개왕같이 요 말에 레균도 요 말에 권조숨 요 말에 세디 록다 되네 록다데 매바다와로 차고 매바다와지 제가 차고 다디데 원주다 조라서 봐 완전 조 심진이 차상 유코리 그래서 디수 쇠바리 세 삼다디 다 조도래 대체사다 디 차상다 록다리 해시 록바다와들 조도다 꿀팁게 천이요래 조도다 꿀팁 니가 해야 되지.
The wrong views are comprised of either denials of what does exist or assertions or superimpositions of what doesn't exist. So, for example, asserting Isvara, Isvara being an illustration of a creator God, or as we had on Bodhisattva's Way of Life on Wednesday, a fundamental nature, there translated as the general principle. So asserting that something that does not exist, such as the creator, as being existing, and holding that they are the creator of all that exists. So therefore, we see that a wrong view can be either denying what does exist or asserting something that does not exist as existing.
대남니 사다 된 강도 시기다 뇨모바티게 시로 대남니 두다 공호 투몽교 온도 제비게 뇨모병의지 인지 엄마 탱규비 루기 눈이 오도 제바기로 오사데 다른 난달라 디간 시 뇨모바티게 지상한테 좀다 투몽이 온도 제비 뇨모몽의 생각이 디고 시바레스 근데 탱규비 투몽만이 비 뇨모디 마레스 제가 탱규비 그런 투몽만이 비 뇨모고 시야디 제마 근데 지금 타바침비게 메시라기 리우갑시 뭐 시대 그 손도 갑을 된바 제야에서 오다.
And then this sub-outline concludes with, these are the mental afflictions as identified from the perspective that is common to both the higher and lower tenet systems. The Prasangika Madhyamika system will be explained below. So later in the text, the unique presentation of the Prasangika in terms of the afflictions will be presented.
나리네 당은주디 뉴모바 지대기위 수세에 있어야 된다. 당한실의 뉴모봉을 송어듯이 대대형을 다 지대기위 수제라 당은주의 뉴모바 제디 자와 다세 마릭바디네 자와디 뇽모바 차상에 제위기디 다세 마릭바레 세지 소요디 넬야 네 직다세디다 다세 마릭바세디 데스 카하르스티비고 와도시 시고레 디사디니게 직다다 마릭바 소소 되바다나 소소 되바다나 아니 베나 타번 돈발라 멤버 중지 바바 밥데 네 타비기 니루 미사와나 델은 주진지 로케와 따르 풍비 니루 니루 사와라 지비 마리비 멤버레 풍보레 다도 추베 로케바데 로케바 게라 델레 뉴모샤남 요스 데 뉴모 기술이 시고레
So we're looking in this chapter at the first of the three outlines presenting true origins. And the outline is how the mental afflictions arise. So we looked at this morning in terms of the introduction to that, which asserted that the afflictions are primary. And then we came to the three sub-outlines. The first we've looked at now, the identifying of the mental afflictions. Now we come to the second, the stages by which the mental afflictions arise. So this then now presents two views on, or let's say opinions, on whether the ignorance of self-grasping and the view of the transitory collection are distinct or whether they are the same thing. So firstly, in the first paragraph, it presents them as distinct, as separate. If the view of the transitory collection and ignorance, so this is the ignorance of self-grasping, are posited as distinct, the stages of how the mental afflictions arise must be understood in the following manner. For instance, once darkness has fallen on a coiled rope, the mind will apprehend it as a snake if the state or the status of the rope is not clear. Likewise, because the darkness of ignorance obscures the clear state of the aggregates, the misapprehension of the aggregates as the self arises, and from that, the other mental afflictions arise.
주진별 로기리스 개와 따라서도 당중에 타바로 시도 신의 지 교교를 지여가지 난파 니마 서르로지도 세우라메디 미파다의 세우라메디 갑리아 분이때는 타바디 되다는 주인한신시 되되되 어디 분이 주시도 선비게 삼는 기고레스 제산다 우단다의 타바디 지금 넘시 서울아메데다 나로라 차에서 니도 추이체 델레피 주두도 선비로 기고레스 니나디 타바디 주디리 주레샤 선비로 기와레 마도 돈다 오마라 주야마 타바레리로 와스 제사디 니네기 타바디 뭐 타바이마 마셰바 몽베 원게 몽바지 몽바레 몽티요레스 제사디 몽제 데 타바진바스 타바디 주리에 삼바 로디다데 니 마리 바세야지.
So reading then the illustration. For instance, once darkness has fallen on a coiled rope, the mind will apprehend it as a snake if the state or the status of the rope is not clear. So this refers to when the sun's setting, if one sees a particular shape and it arises to your mind as being a snake, then what has arisen to what your mind believes it's seeing is a snake. Your mind has understood this shape as being that of a snake. But in reality, it's just a coiled rope. So for the reason for this misapprehension is in the conceptual mind, not from what one is seeing, but in the conceptual mind. And that is the ignorance of confusion. So this is an illustration of ignorance, misapprehending reality. Because in reality, it's a rope. But due to ignorance in the mind, this ignorance of confusion in the mind, this rope is experienced as or conceived as being a snake.
Dine, and the Pumbo, Pumbo, Kasore, Petiche, Dine Pumbi, Nelu, Sawa, Jibi, Marikbe, that the she Marik Pasadi, Kanchile, Nga, said the Tati, the Susu, Nga, said the Mariba said, Dinigi, Yugi, Nilu, the Tonya, Save Matova, we need to the Maimba, and the Matovi knocked on doors. Jadi the Mariba said, we Yugi needs to Masheba, Ben Taba Drudu, singing the Taba the Drusia, singing to more Taba the Taba in by the Masheba, the Maripache, Beroshi. Dina sing as Yugi, Nilu, Masheba, Mondigan, Dinigi, Norn Zindu, but did Angele, Maripa Sha, Dicha. Person this turn in Maripasha. Then that dela the Maripa, that in that the Chictas, she or one, she did that, dinner, she that, Pumbo, Pumbi, that point, Chita, the immediate that, the she Pumbo, Nga said, Nadele, Mishine, and then Pumbi, Nilu, Sawala, and the Jibi said, Pumbi, Nilu, the Hakoya, Sebu, we need the Hakoala, and Jibi, Maripa, the Jipche. The Momba Mariba the Jipche, then Mumbe, and Pumbo Dadu to us in Zingores, Zima Kigores, Tua, Yelas, Tedadi, Jitaki, Gasari, Jitaki to the Hidua. Pumbo la Miche, and Pumbo di more Sebu Pumbo, but Sebu Massa Delia, Jipche, Sujibus, Maribi Jibore, Maribi Mubati, Jipche. And Masawa, Hamowache, then the Pumbody, Datu Trupa, and the Datu Trupa, and Zing, and the Jitatis, get at the Diredo. Jita. Dida, Dambo de la Marik by Gis, the Marik be Pirisha, the Mariboni Ki, the Shim, not in Adia.
And Dapotis and a Pumpo near Sawala, Jupa Marik, Congi, you, the Dakre.
Is that the Jita Kisha, Jita, the aging of the Jita Kishi, Jita Digi Karl Kawali Migos and Nada, Nayu was here, the new Pumbodilla, Pumbos, that Nase, Nase, the Pumbodilla, that thing on the Pumbodilla share, the new Pumbola Minia, Pumbi, Nilu Tea, Sawa Chilia, Tick, winning Tatu to Maimba Chilia, in Maribi, Jipche, Tibige. Maribi, Mumbai, Jibaenza, and the Datu to Badzingores. Uniga Pumba, that is that Della Jigda della, the Gidi Da said, Maripa said, Inji Miji, Kansa in Goya Marwa. You can't say me, mashing by the Mombasa, been a Kawachi, been a setting by Chilinas, the setting by Mashi by Mondo and the Mariba Chaderova. That's in Goya Marwa. Mariba, that's the Maripi Udela, Momba della, Udela, Kansa Yore, Pumbo Yore, Dimembe, Shandayomure, Ben Manzuki, Delia, Chike, Haji, Yume, Hamo, Haji, Mondo by the Momba, the Hamoa della Mombas, the Mariba Chaderova. That's in Goya Maripala. Marikpa does in Kayore, Main Kayore, Niga also a Chileda. I said, the G Marikpa said, Yugi Nilu mashing but Montuba de la Maripa, said Shawar Dagangela, Mumba. Yugi Nilu mashing but Mumba, the Yu Nilu de la Gansa Yore, and the Dimembe Gansa, Maimba Yore, Naso Yungurua, so you Karalimina, Dinilu mashing by the Ne, Montuba ina. And Maripa, and the Lenji, you got sometimes mashing of Montuadi, Montpellier, mashing of Hamoa, did Agile, Lenji, Mopa Maripa. San you conjure San Yes, sometimes Mashipa, Montu, Hamoa, Montu, and Hamoa, the Ludida, somebody, not on the Chadu, Momba said. There's conjure Mopa Maripa. I didn't say down to get Da, you may get sometimes the Tenica, Kaya Mashipa, Montu, not on the Chadu, somebody, Mopa Maripa. The Mombe Maripa said, Yuki, Nilukti, Yimin, Jevachi, the Mashipa, Montu, and the Nachtom, Jedu, the Kaya Mashi, Nachtom, some did that Maripa said Chagore.
the analogy, for instance, this hopefully is quite clear now, to explain the meaning of it in relation to understanding that, look in the first sentence, the view of the transitory collection and the ignorance of self-grasping are distinct. So in the context where they are seen as distinct, first there's the ignorance of self-grasping, which can lead to the view of the transitory collection. So the view of so what ignorance does is it serves to obscure the object that is being observed. And that then is seen in the first part of the explanation. Likewise, because the darkness of ignorance obscures the clear state of the aggregates. So in this case, the object is the aggregates, and the role ignorance is playing is that it obscures how it exists in reality. So that's the first part, that's ignorance. From that, now the view of the transitory collection will follow. The misapprehension, so that's just how we normally translate this word, as wrong or mistaken, not as wrong, so as mistaken. So misapprehension of the aggregates as the self arises, and from that the other mental affliction. So not that far. So from the ignorance, the misapprehension of the aggregates as the self arises. So here, for those who assert that the view of the transitory collection and the ignorance of self-grasping are separate or distinct, this is the sequence. And the role. So the role of ignorance is like darkness obscuring the object, preventing it from being seen clearly. That's the role of ignorance, leads to the view of the transitory collection, misapprehending the aggregates. To further make the distinction clear, ignorance is in relation to all that is perceived. So all that is perceived is obscured by ignorance. That's bad English. So all that is obscured is perceived all that is perceived is obscured by ignorance, the ignorance of self-grasping. But it does not always lead to the view of the transitory collection. Why? The view of the transitory collection only is in relation to the self, the I and mind, so the self and the aggregates. So, for example, ignorance will obscure the understanding of karma, leading to a wrong view, saying there's no such thing as cause and effect. Now, in that, there's no role for the view of the transitory collection. This is an ignorance, misunderstanding karma, and we saw in the wrong views, it denies the existence of cause and effect. Or in terms of the three jewels, denying the three jewels, denying their existence. So there too, there is no role played by the view of the transitory collection, because the view of the transitory collection is not in relation to an object such as cause and effect or the three jewels, but only in relation to the self and aggregates.
Da denegi di jelia de nyumo bo de sha tang control la so ba nga ja la so ba nyumo shen nam ji gi de sen de le nyumo shen nam ji wo sen du ji go re se che che da bo da se mari pa di ge de ne di jelia ne ji de di ge di jelia de ja control nga ja nyumo ba la so nyumo ba shen da di ji go re che de le nyumo shen nam ji wo se de ji da ji nyumo ba ji rin ba ro sti ne se se.
And in the final part of the paragraph, then the whole sequence comes clear with, and from that the other mental afflictions arise. So that's the third part in the sequence of the presentation for those who see the view of the transitory collection and ignorance of self-grasping as being distinct. First comes ignorance, then depending on if the object is the self and the aggregates, then follows the view of the transitory collection, and then follows the various other afflictions.
And in ya jigda da mari ba ni jig ra sam da we ne di ni jig du de ba de ne ge de ba tar ina ne ga ji was da bo ne jigda khorang ji ge za jigda za wa ni mo jigda ji di she lian de ni mo ba shen de ge ji go re se chi za wa jigde wo se to de ni jig du de ba da na jigda ni nyumo ye zao was.
So that's the presentation for those who see them as distinct. Now, for those who see it as the same, then the next paragraph, but it's just one sentence. If those two are posited as the same, the view of the transitory collection itself is the root of the mental afflictions.
I didn't. That did Chibare sometime, doesn't maribada, doesn't mariba said, and Chiden Chiba sometime, and it didn't Cochita Horon that you more Zawa maribadi that Chita Horon is.
So just be sure that this is clear, because they are saying, so in the second paragraph, those two are posited as the same, then from whether one is talking about the ignorance of self-grasping as we normally do, or if one talks about the view of the transitory collection, from that, because that's seen as the same, follow the afflictions.
대양 소데 지다 지다 나도 지다 스타도 소와나 랑신 소소 랑신 소소 바리수 리수 쥐버체라 데더르 제네 랑초라 차바다 현초라 당와 중스 단데 지디 제네 지디 원게다 뇨모바신 되샤당 콘루 중나디 송고래.
In fact, when the view of the transitory collection apprehends a self, a distinction is made between self and other. Once that is made, attachment to one's own side and hatred for the other side arise.
Rangli Shandi Odi Konzu Shenri said Pa Shenri Dinga Mari Kon Shenri said Kansa Pa Yewa Chedi, Dini Yewa Chedu Gores. Yewa Dinig sometime Yewa Chedu, Dini Karsosne, Yewa Chene, Dini Rangchola Chapas and Susu Chola Chapakia, Shen Cholia, Dangwa Gedi, Yungores, Kondu Gedi, Chatan Gedi in the Yungores. She said, is that a rung? Da said, Nga. Nga said, Chita Zianti Nga sin Zingurua. She said, Nga Sidu Shan Chansu, Nga Maria Hoshan Sigura. She said, Chita Yawachi Nga said Zinu, but Nga said Zimba in Zangar Tatu Zimba Nga said Zinu. Then Rang Manganti Shansi Yawachi Gore. She said, Chita Kisevi Chelia, Nga said Zimba is there, Nga said Shansi Yawachi didn't even go there. Di Shen Legoma, that is Shen Dash and Gansa, sure. Just a Nas and Aris, a Gansa, Nas. The Shanda di Yele, Shen Gansa, Shanda di Namare Shen.
Reading it again. In fact, when the view of the transitory collection apprehends a self, a distinction is made between self and other. So to be clear here, so the view of the transitory collection we know relates to the self, but the I and mine. So in this context, they both are included in self. Other refers to other people or other beings other than oneself. So the self here, because it's the view of the transitory collection, I and mine, but other is that which is not I, and therefore other beings. And towards them, then, the next sentence, then attachment to those part of one's own group, and then hatred's just a bit strong, aversion arise to those not part of one's group.
rāngdā shēn yewa chēn yu dēne dāgīwa dīla ngī jāla, ngī nye sēn, dēne kō dīsu shēn jī jāla, shēn jī nye sēn, dīla yewa chēn yunguruwa dā.
So first, because of the view of the transitory collection, one first apprehends oneself, then there is all that is, or every being that is other than oneself. And then in relation to independence on the relationship one has, attachment, aversion, and so forth arise.
dīne chē yu dīne yewa chē ne ngā rāng dāng shēn yewa chē, dīne rāng kī chō, shēn kī chō sē dī bā yewa chē, dū chī yewa chē, kā ne chē yu dīne chē ne, dīne yewa chē ne, dī jē le kā rīng wā sē ne, dā rāng chō la chā pā sē, rāng la chā pā, dīne rāng kī ngī chī kē jā lā sē, dīne kē rāng chō la chā pā sē. 다 시행이 어디든 말 딩 시행 디송을 뉴그리스 시행 처리야 just 마가와 차다 당하게리 차단게리 되는 시용고를 해야지 디리도다.
What we've seen thus far is from the view of the transitory collection. So this was presented above as the sixth affliction that follows the grasping at I and mine. So that's included within self, and everything that is other than that is considered other. This then is followed by the afflictions, so attachment and all within that class for what benefits the I and mine, and anger or aversion towards all that is considered to harm the I and mine.
나네 달라미네 캥바 계승아 얘기해 소소를 달라미네 나 야후인가 약쇼인 있어야다. 아니 컨트롤되네 나 야그래서 달라미네 아니 나 얘기를 해서
Then the text continues. Also, conceit, so this is pride, arises upon observing that self. So pride was we had above as the third affliction. So we see then how pride follows from the view of the transitory collection, and from that follows attachment, the first one above, anger, the second, and now pride, the third.
다 디니라 다시도 진진 안 다도 다와 소다 대단 제위기 줘봐 nemba chodo zimba ki o sire da dine deji 다시게 탈진게 따와 되다 아니 두슈 초싱이 삼는 게 되게 되는 기원에서 시도.
Text continues. That very self is then held to be permanent or subject to annihilation and is viewed as the self and so forth. So this then refers to, again, what we've seen above, the arisal of the extreme views. So this was the seventh affliction mentioned above, that the extreme of non-existence, the extreme of existence, or the extreme of nihilism. These may well then follow. Again, we see the sequence all starting from the view of the transitory collection.
다치도 짐바 소도 계스 되네 다스 이게 되네 대단 제비기 다 되네게 제비 쩌방한 발라 초도 짐바 요세 되네 추림기 쩌방한 바서 류하게 쩌바 되네게 두슈되게 초도 짐바 추림나 두슈 초도 짐바 되게 기고래서
Can I? 네, 그는 망고 색소나. 대담적으로 쥐바.
쥐방은 말 주림도 초진세야 돼. 예다 숨도.
Then the sequence continues. Then it's reading from the text: the bad activities connected with it are upheld as supreme. So this refers to the eighth non-virtue above, the eighth affliction, I think. I may be wrong on the numbering. Trying to remember it's 8. But it refers to seeing what did we have here? Religious conduct, this must be 9. Holding religious conduct and wrong ethics as supreme. So this then too may follow.
다와 초선다 주름도 초선이 되지.
니가.
니가도 다라 딩이 다도 진바. 다도 진신 다와 소세 다와 초선이 되지. 대단 제비 주방한 바 초도 진바와 주름도 초선.
Yes, Geshe was just correcting me. So let me read it together. So pride arises in the very self that is held to be permanent or subject to annihilation and is viewed as the self and so forth. So that sentence is relating to the arisal of wrong views, which we had above as the 8th. And then faulty ethics is the next sentence, the 9th one. Then the bad activities connected with it are upheld as supreme. So in this way, we're seeing how so many of the afflictions follow.
that loktatiri deshinwa dame tembe tembada de tembe leje da denshi da gonjo sola deda medo she ne zimbi lokta tavis so deda kanjile then deshindu sene dame ba tembe tembada side sanyi nganjuge da nambi dame da yo mares da sedi Kala do rang when you do better, your marry said your marry sumbi, Dumbadida, Dumba Sangema, Dumba Sange Mares. Then that is Sange Mare, Shingo Mars, Denigi, sometimes to Loktatiche. Then Denigi Sangi, Denigi Tami, but Dumbadi Martin, leg into your Sada, Deji your Sadida, and the conjure your Sadida. Demba mare, your mares, leg your mare, Koshipana, your mare, then she said, your conjunct your mares, and losing some time, Ludita, Loktasit in the keyboard.
Continues. Likewise, the wrong views are generated, I think. So this is then the affliction of wrong views. The teacher who taught selflessness, the actions and effects he taught, the 4 truths, the jewels, and so forth, do not exist. So then this is referring to wrong views above, that afflicted intelligence, whereby someone who rejects the teachings of the Buddha will necessarily also reject the existence of Buddhas, in that if one rejects the teachings of the Buddha, one is rejecting the cause of being bound in samsara, as well as then the paths that need to be cultivated, as well as the result that is attained, that of Buddhahood. So therefore, wrong views also can follow from the initial view of the transitory collection.
Sambat, Disangi in the Legun de Yuna Mena, Sambat, Tenshi Yuna Mena, Gunjo Yuna Mena, Sambat, the Nigi and Dumbati and the Chiki, Dumbongani in the Mina, Sambat, the Nig sometimes Tisum message.
And then finally, that of doubt. Alternatively, the doubt is generated thinking, do they exist or not? Are they a certain way or not? So this then shows the sequence starting with ignorance or, because it's seen in this presentation is the same, ignorance or the view of the transitory collection, from that, how each of the other afflictions can arise.
Adin namje les da yue ne shendu shi dashin chele jinda nang dida dane yongjilwe nyeba tamje jungwa gyuru shi songso osa.
And a further quotation from the commentary on Compendium of Valid Cognition. So we're at the top of page 170. When there's a self, there's awareness of other. Dividing between them brings grasping and anger. Every fault comes into being closely connected with those two.
And another issue, da yue dan de shen du shi da shen chele jinda nang dida dani yongjilwe nyeba tamje jungwa gyuru si de chesan dang zo nga se de nga ra shin juba dene 시키 지대티게 대 아니 딜레네 시해세 봐 여와치 라시 여와치 안 딜레네 랑 초라 차비 차와다 현초라 다위 너 컨트롤해서 봐 디네게 녀모 버릭차사 디네신의 용리 사실 또 나디리노.
So this verse just presents what has been presented in more detail, which is that through grasping at the self as truly existent, or through the view of the transitory collection, we divide the world into ourselves and all others. And from that then follows afflictions, attachment to those that we believe will benefit the I and mine, aversion towards those that we believe will cause harm to I and mine, as well as all the other resulting afflictions.
녀모 디니 기월 제스당 동아게 규디 내다 녀모 버레스 군주된 바들에서다 군주된 바디 두스인데 송거와 당데.
What we've been looking at is the second noble truth, true origins, which points out the origins of our suffering, the origins of our being bound in the suffering realms of samsara, namely karma that has been accumulated together with the afflictions, or under the influence of the power of the afflictions. And this karma, therefore, is contaminated by the afflictions, leading to us continuing this process of uncontrolled rebirth, of circling in cyclic existence.
나 제상 코와를 깨월림바데 인지미주 윤이가 상고를 양의 레 상고 레다 녀모바 니가 고월 디나이나 디니 나네 직마상나 녀모바 유제 레메나 아니 코와를 기토에 기요 말에 안 레여바네 녀모바 메나 너 코와를 기기 말에 제상 코와를 깨를 윤이가 상고를 해서 그러다. 니가 조기심에다 니가 상고를 했어.
Here then, to understand true origins, we understand there are two origins of suffering, karma and afflictions. With our afflictions, we accumulate this karma that is contaminated, and it ripens, again, in relation to the supportive condition of the afflictions, leading to our perpetual rebirth in samsara.
딩이긴 안에다 다 조어수진 요모바들이스 가르세네 요모바들이 세상당 아주 조어디 레디 메바스야 삼마다지 요모바디 메바스야바이나 아줄이야 나르게 나미게 레 마솔게 레 나바 코알게 레 같이 사여바이네야 아주 요모바디 님보텐지 요모바디 빵바이나 디니 코알게 레 여바이네 코알게 두 말이스.
In this presentation on true origins, we first looked at identifying these two causes and then separating them as to which is primary. And the primary cause for being bound in samsara is the afflictions, and two reasons were presented for those. One, looking back, in that if one still has past accumulated karma abiding on one's continuum, but no afflictions, in other words, afflictions have been abandoned together with their seeds, there's no supportive condition to ripen that karma. So those imprints may well abide in one's continuum, but they cannot ripen. The second reason why afflictions are primary is forward-looking. That if one imagines all karma has been purified from one's continuum, but the afflictions together with their seeds haven't been abandoned, then immediately karma will be accumulated anew. Those afflictions will ripen and new karma will be accumulated. So therefore, for these two reasons, it's our afflictions that we need to focus our attention on and strive to abandon.
어디 자당 좀 뭐바디 님보팅 고래 세지다 뉴모바팅에다 난 뉴모바티를 가려요 세나당 좀 뭐여와 주로지 뭐서 주로 뭐서 말다 도나 조디 단 뉴모바다는 가지고 미셰들이야 조 마리바 델레티니 기고래 세지 다조 마리비 님보팅 고래 당은 미지단다 덴딩이 뉴모바디 빵고도 빵제 되네 빵바이나 되네 타바세 투구리에스 지자 녀모가 사본에 제 빵송바이나 타바 투구리 지자 타바 투에다 누가균에 매바자 시와짱야레스 대자 되네자다 도스녀모가 빵베 빵바 타바 투구도 셈베다 타바 돈예게 삼로지 예게 된다라 먼저디 동아시에다 동아유 레다 녀모가 시에디 김전 데네시 시에 지자 데네 하고와 제네다 녀모바도 빵베 빵바 타바 투구도 셈베게 타바 돈예 삼바 기고고레세
So understanding then the two origins that keep us bound in samsara, and of those two, which one is primary, we need to abandon those afflictions then. And how to do so? By applying the antidotes. But before one can apply antidotes, one needs to know what the antidotes are to be applied against. In other words, one needs to be able to identify, to recognize the afflictions. Then we had the presentation on afflictions in a group of 10. Of those 10, there is one that is primary, and that is ignorance. In order to abandon the afflictions, we need to rely on the antidotes, and in particular, against this root affliction, that of ignorance. And when one abandons our ignorance, together with its seeds, one gains liberation from the suffering realms of samsara. So the bringing together then the reflection presented here as well as what has been looked at over previous months. So these first two noble truths. One comes to recognize the reflection that we're bringing together on these two noble truths leads to the generation of definite emergence. And definite emergence has these components of being focused on emerging from samsara, so gaining liberation from the sufferings of samsara, through, and the second component, through abandoning the afflictions, in particular that of ignorance. But the focus will be on all afflictions, in particular ignorance. So again, the outcome of the meditations on suffering, as well as origins, is to give rise to definite emergence, which has its two focuses on emerging from the suffering realms of samsara and attaining liberation from suffering. Secondly, through abandoning the afflictions, in particular ignorance.
산이 건조라 로다 레균데라 로다 시네기 디 마기에 탑람라 언제다 문이신다 레균데다 건조유메 제바체 수수 체명에 봐냐바이나 단디니 무인이스 또바자 로다기 말아 아니게 시잉에바 데니게 냐바 메냐바이나 당하는 주게 라마당 라주게데 기회 신연다 데니게 라마는 밀야 손샤베들의 이치지에 아데 레균에 세동의 유타시리 세다 건조세의 유타시리 세다 데네기 삼다지 이치제 토안의 도시는 대유바 삼다바이나 다 이치제바이나 당 로다기에게 레균데다 건조이면 로다기에게 원고를 차고래 로다기에게다 로다디게 사본나 제바 방비 님보다 차고 말이네 원고 마기에게 탑람로지들이
Amongst the various afflictions that were presented, that of wrong views can be gravely dangerous. So the way to guard oneself from giving rise to wrong views is to develop a valid cognizer in relation to correct or valid views. So to come by means of a valid cognizer to realize that from causes, the presentation of cause and effect, and the presentation of the three jewels. The way then to progress towards a valid cognizer is through relying on a teacher, a spiritual teacher that you have trust in. and following their guidance in terms of cultivating an understanding of cause and effect in the three jewels. So this is how to prevent oneself or guard oneself from coming under the influence of wrong views. It will not lead to the abandonment of the imprints of wrong views, but it will prevent wrong views from being manifest and thereby deceiving one. And that process will also prevent doubt, but in particular the doubt that deceives one, turns one away from believing in things that exist, such as the three jewels and cause and effect. It will prevent such doubt from arising and influencing one to the extent that one ends up developing a wrong view. I presented then an antidote for wrong views as well as to doubt. Antidotes then to the affliction of attachment would be recognizing that attachment exaggerates the qualities of something. Whatever that we are drawn towards, we desire, we attach to, is because of the immediately preceding condition of of improper mental engagement. And by means of improper mental engagement, our attachment arises, having now the qualities of the object exaggerated. So recognizing the role that this ignorance plays in deceiving us, we then remind ourselves of the faults of both the object and this mind of attachment, or being deceived by this mind of attachment. And the antidote to anger is similar, in this extent that you realize the role that improper mental engagement has played, deceiving us in terms of exaggerating the faults of whatever we have anger towards. And the antidote here is again coming to understand reality. The object does not exist in this negative way, and also the cultivation of love, wanting the very best for others. This too will guard us, or guard our mind from strong anger from arising.
sabon ne cheba pango mar sabon che pango mar da sabon ne cheba pangba la dase marik ba di pango khore sesan dase marik ba yin bo tienje da dame ba se di ma so ke dame to je dame ba to be sherap di gomba la tine da dase ge sabon ne cheba pang de da nyomo ba chasang ge sabon cheba pa ye di re zawa dase marik ba di sabon ne cheba pang ba ina da nyomo ba chasang pa ro ge ya ba cha ro ba.
By developing these antidotes, such as to attachment and anger, as well as those mentioned before in terms of doubts and wrong views, one needs to cultivate knowledge through relying on one's teacher, and then investigate, analyze, thinking for yourself in the way guided by one's teacher. This will lead to one developing a valid cognizer. So this will be an unmistaken understanding, transformative understanding of, for example, that the three jewels exist, that cause and effect exists. But this will prevent these afflictions from becoming manifest, but it will not eradicate the seeds of the afflictions. For that, one has to realize emptiness or selflessness. In particular, one needs to gain a direct realization of emptiness in order to eradicate the seeds of their afflictions and thereby ensure that they can never ripen again.
바바시 제인데 뇨모바디리 제가 뇨모도 방고도 선배다 타바토도 요더니 듬바기 다지자 타바토를 야 바르 제한이 가르스는 뇨모바디리 샤스 제가 뇨모바이즈다 뇨모바데 방고고레세 디링 임보티엔데 람냠네 제데 리고다 람냠네 타바토고도 선배다 동아기 타바토에기 동아인 유디 뇨모바 레다 뇨모바디 임바다 하고 와지 제가 딜레 탈비게 타바토고도 선배게 다 타바도니 삼게 지난 다 타바 토발라 니뇽모데 방고도와 디마바나 타바 토토고메데 다디바야라 간에스 방고레스네 녜레 님보 텐체 람공고리에세 람냠네 바데 딜리고라다 람냠네 바시르 람귤레 겐디게나 코로즈미 담에 바토비 셰랍 띵에제 콤체네 아니 진소 파신 중냠네 진 도스 람 콤네 모소 님보 띵고로와다 당한주 람귤레 께메와인자다 람냠네 제고엔자다 한주게 디 람디 귤레 께 된다랴 아니 예주가 삼바데 야네 야도 삼다야다 데네게 다음에 거 삼다야 도시네 야네 야도 도시노 공비아리 고주야데 자고를 받아 당 예주도 야네 야도 삼다 예주 공제 주마만이 바기어 끼어봐 저거를 받아 제가 데네게 공비아라 소바 데네 다음에 거 삼다야 도시네 다도 주변에 간에서 마루비 딘데 남자 삼다제 다음에 뭐 삼다야지 다 도시는 삼다도는 람기에 귤지 되네게 깨와셔야다 되네게는 될이야 소사tip자 주름소야다 진바다 소바고면 근데 전주 좀 야라 소바냐면 제디게 자고로 봐 되네게 없는 예중의 삼바디 바 공제네 다 코의 동안에 저제 타르바 토부도 선빙해 주 되네게 삼바디 코월 이보 자기니 민도 코월 타르바 토부도 선빙해 삼노디 제마 많이 버지 계속 봐 있는데 람귤에 끼와 책으로 와서네
In order to gain liberation or freedom from suffering, one has to abandon the afflictions together with their seeds. To do this, one needs to come to recognize that it is due to the afflictions that I continue to suffer. It's due to the afflictions that I will continue to suffer until they are eventually abandoned. And then the method by which one comes to eventually abandon the afflictions is cultivating the paths, cultivating the mental paths within us that lead to liberation, lead to freedom from these afflictions. So to give rise to a path, one has to develop definite emergence. In order to generate definite emergence, one needs to have the wish for liberation. And maybe here instead of wish, it's because it's much stronger than this. It's a deep yearning for liberation. Nothing else matters, just the attainment of liberation. And together with this deep yearning for liberation, one has the determined attitude to abandon the afflictions. Because yearning for a result doesn't mean anything unless one is determined to accumulate the causes. And this is also aided by a second key component, or maybe even a prerequisite. So prior to even giving up, developing the determined attitude to abandon the afflictions in order to gain liberation, one needs to recognize that samsara has no abiding value. This comes about through the meditations that we've been doing for some months on suffering by the various presentations, to recognize that, of course, suffering feelings we want to abandon, but feelings of happiness are also deceptive, and eventually even neutral feelings can be deceptive. As long as one is bound in samsara, one will suffer. There is nowhere, anywhere in the existences of samsara where happiness can be found, lasting sustained happiness can be found. That understanding, conjoined with, and it's the afflictions that keep me bound in these suffering realms, I have to abandon these afflictions in order to gain liberation. This leads to the yearning for liberation, which is the mind of definite emergence. Then, how to actually fulfill this yearning? It means cultivating the paths within. So to do that, one trains in the 6 perfections. To train in the 6 perfections means primarily to cultivate the wisdom realizing selflessness, assisted by the practices of accumulation and purification, which are generosity, ethical restraint, patience, and enthusiastic perseverance. But in order to really give rise to a path, it's this prior part of reflecting on definite emergence. This is something that we have to do again and again, so that it arises in us in a way that is uncontrived. So we need to cultivate definite emergence by reflecting on the faults of samsara, true sufferings, as well as the origins of samsara, in particular the afflictions. And we need to do so to the point where we are so determined to gain freedom that we readily achieve calm abiding, and thereby can give rise to uncontrived definite emergence. Then we will have a path in our continuum, and the power with which we engage in the cultivation of the wisdom realizing selflessness, as well as the companion practices of generosity, ethics, patience, and enthusiastic perseverance, will be immense. And this way, progression comes quickly.
Leda nyomo ba ni ko res ko wala ke wala bala na debigi ne ko wala ke wala bala leda nyomo ba ni ko re so da su me ke ko wala ke wala ba leda nyomo ni ko res ji an de xie hua da de ji da de debigi ko re ne la ko wala ke wala bala leda nyomo ba ni ko res ji ko wala ke wala bala leda nyomo ba ni ko res Kowe ne la jiwa lemba la le da nyuma ba ni ku ma le se an ji xie kowe ne la jiwa lemba la de ba la jiwa lemba la le da nyuma ba ku ma le se de ba la jiwa lemba la kowe ne le ne se de sa ne se ro de sa ne se di de sa ne ngo de sa ne se di se ro ji zang kowe ne se de ba da su me de ye kowe ne le se 아주 되어봐도 콜위니에 대해서는 지금 코바 차상 될래 기와는 뒤고로와 지금 콜위니에 대해서 코바 뒤서기니에 대해서 콜위니에 대해서 그래. 제가다 콜위니에 기와는 발에 레다 뉴모번 이 구글이 베스는 고구 말해야 되다. 다리 야 사버는 사버를 체결을 하는데
where beings experience the suffering of samsara, the sufferings of samsara are in the various abodes of samsara. So these abodes are where samsara is experienced, and these are usually presented as 3: the desire realm, the form realm, the formless realm. And our suffering, that is, the suffering of beings there, is due to their afflictions. Their rebirth there is due to the afflictions. That being said, though, it is not pervasive, or it's not definite, maybe like this, that one can still nevertheless be in the realms of samsara, the abodes of samsara, without or not due to karma and afflictions. Or not due to the afflictions, sorry, not due to the afflictions.
Deval ma jewa shengi dunda le shenle pando duye dunda le ya deval jewa lenje debigi mi jewa le la jewa lenje ani jewa la shorwa desu jesa denige sanje da jenshi ma papa dige jajuma dige deval jewa lemba le kowe ne le jewa lemba le ina kowe ne le jewa lemba de le da nyomo mo jewa lemba le wesne ma le sanje da jajuma dige le da nyomo ba sa ba sa ba sa nyomo ongi kiwa le yo ma to konzo samshi de kiwa le ba le samshi do kono zo ate kiwa se be rawa ye le rawa yi de da le da nyomo ba tyo mo re sa de kono de ni sa de ba de bi la da de bi milia ane shen den ju bi chi shen le pan do ju ye chi do de bi la re kiwa sang ji ge da jan shi ba pa ba de ge zha jun ba de ge de bi la re kiwa le len je ne le da de de bi mil kiwa le ba yong go res de so sa de ba kiwa le ba re ko wi ne le kiwa le ba re yin na yang ane le da nyomo mo kiwa le ba ma re dam ko zum ge wi sa wa ge wa le de kiwa le ba re sa sam shi de kiwa le ba re so 레기 왕이 기와len ba mares samshin de kiwa gewa ba shi le de kiwa da le da nyomo 왕이 기와len ba mares.
So whilst the situation for us is entirely this, that we are born in samsara against our will, without freedom, due to contaminated karma and afflictions, it doesn't have to be this way. Buddhas and bodhisattvas choose to take rebirth amongst us, amongst humans in the desire realm, amongst gods in the desire realm, and amongst gods in the form realm. But they take rebirth there, not under the power of karma and afflictions, but under the power of their aspiration, their wish. They choose, through their compassion, to be born amongst samsaric beings. So they are in the abodes of samsara, without being samsarians, without being samsaric beings. And this is because they are not born here due to contaminated karma and afflictions, but rather due to their prayer.
Korwar kiwa lemba mares. Korwe nele kiwa lemba, korwar kiwa lemba mares. Chesa da jajumba da sangi ji deba le kiwa lemba di. Ane lada mida kiwa lemba di, korwe nele kiwa lemba res. Ina korwar kiwa lemba mares. On dus shawore.
So Buddhas and Arhats, they are not born in samsara, but they are born in the abodes of samsara.
That is it. That Kowar Kiwalemba, that later Numo won't kill this. Later Numo, Kowar Kiwalembalana, later Numo won't kill Lingores. Korea near the Kiwalena, later Numo won't kill Lingo Mares. That indeed Chabaru chair your daddy.
And this is because they are not born in the way that we are, which is under the control, forced by our karma, our contaminated karma and afflictions. Rather, due to their aspiration, again, it's not using the word praise, their aspiration to be born within or amongst samsaric beings. They are born in the realms or the abodes of samsara, but they are not of samsara. So this is with our Buddhas and foe destroyers.
The Karesina Deji Leda, New Cover Kiwalen by the Leda, New Mong Kiwalen Guris Larva. Now that me to what Guru, or the Cover Kiwalen by the Leda, New Mong Kiwalen by Ina, the Sangi Dang, Janju Judgment by the Ye, and then in Devalia Kiwalen, Shannon to Yoruas, Dubil Hala Kiwalen by your Dubi Mili Kiwalen by Yoruas, and then there's one Leda, New Mong Kiwalen by Reves, then the Yomo Pamba Marives, Judgment by one, Sanya Papa Revas and Sutu Tavina. 아니 대화 대발이 끼와lên 밀레들 하다 밀리 끼와lên 요마를 나 요마로 와다 예 되니 매나 산 요즘에 되기 밀 끼와lên 바로와 되니게 요마를 나 요마 제가 되니 요로 와다 요바에서 다 갈러스네 디저 대발 끼와lên 바리 이네 코월 끼와lên 바 말이 콜웬디를 끼와lên 바리 코월 끼와lên 바 말이스 이렇게 같이 오르네.
I'm making this point, just it's a bit of fun, but it answers the question that beings who are not in the abodes of samsara, so those amongst us in the human realm or in the various god realms, they are not necessarily samsaric beings of samsara. Because if there was this pervasion that only those who were under the control of contaminated karma and afflictions could be reborn in the realms of samsara, then that means Buddha Shakyamuni, as well as all the other Buddhas and foe destroyers, were necessarily ordinary beings. And that is not the case at all. So certainly what is the case is that those who are under the control of their contaminated karma and afflictions, they are born where their karma dictates. And that will necessarily be in samsara. So they are of samsara. Whereas Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, Arya beings, may be born amongst us. So they are dwelling in the abodes of samsara with bodies that look just like the bodies of samsaric beings. But they are not in samsara. They are liberated from samsara. So then thank you. We can conclude there for this weekend. However, if you have questions, then feel free to ask. Then enjoy the rest of your weekend.